Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar. We are going to be working on a few webinars coming up. This is the first of what we're calling our 20-minute series because I feel like an hour sometimes is a bit long for a webinar. So we're just trying to do some quick webinars here. And this first one is about Postman and using Postman to explore the Foxy API. We have a few poll questions that Josh will be adding as we go. And if you have any questions, please just go ahead and ask them. I'd rather you get your questions answered while we're talking about the topic than you sort of just be confused about something that I might not have explained very well. So please just ask. You won't interrupt the flow or anything. And Josh on our end is going to be helping me try to, or he'll draw attention to questions as need be. Okay, so we'll jump right into it. The first, we're going to go through this just as sort of a series of questions. The first question is, what is Postman? That is the topic of the webinar. So Postman is, they describe themselves as a collaboration platform for API development. That's not really what we're focusing on. What we're going to be focusing on is their API client. Postman can do a lot. I believe Ken Lane from Postman is on this webinar. And Ken, if you want to jump in and say anything, we can make you a presenter. But we're going to be focusing just on the client, which is really, really amazing. It can do a lot more, though. The easiest way to understand what the client does is to see it in action, but sort of broadly, you can think of the client as a GUI for curl or a GUI for working with APIs. So if you've done API work in the past, you may have done quick calls with curl in the terminal just to sort of see what's going on, see the response, or you might have even spun up just some demo code in your language of choice like PHP or Node just to fire off requests and see what you get back. I mean, how often do we do that in API development of just, oh, I don't know what I'm getting back here. I don't know what it's doing, and you make the request. So Postman can do all of that way more easily than you can do it yourself. We're not going to talk about downloading Postman. You can obviously figure that out on your own. The next question is, what is a Hypermedia API? So our API is a REST API, but we describe it as a Hypermedia API. That can get really complicated depending on who you ask. You say, what's Hypermedia? And you get somebody like my co-founder, Luke, saying Hypermedia is it's Helios. It's Hypermedia is the engine of application state, which is the worst acronym ever, maybe, and really overcomplicates what Hypermedia is. Hypermedia simply is, or Hypermedia API is simply an API that includes links, URLs, in the response, and you can use those links to navigate the API. And we'll see that in action here very, very shortly. Okay, so first step is going to be download Postman if you haven't already, and follow the steps in the Foxy in our little Postman tutorial. There are a few things in here that are sort of important. One of them I'll show you in just a second. It retains headers when you click on links. And that's really helpful. If you don't have that, Postman becomes a lot less useful in the context of a Hypermedia API. This is the thing though. So we're going to click this run in Postman. And then from there, I'm going to switch my screen share to Postman and we'll see. So On clicking this, we create in Postman a collection. So that's going to open in Postman. And give me just a second. Oops. Gotta switch desktops. Sorry about this. So here's Postman. Now, when you first load Postman up, you'll see this launchpad. And you can, it's got some helpful things. You can do a number of things with it. It starts on this tab. The collections is really what we care about. And when we click that run in Postman, it created this Foxy API collection, which we can expand, and it has a number of different requests that are all ready to go. So we can see we have get, post, put, patch, delete. If anybody is unclear on sort of those basics of API, go ahead and ask me a question, and I can talk about it briefly. But clicking on that, run in Postman, imports this collection. Now the next step is going to be, and this is all covered in our docs, is we need to create an API client in the Foxy admin and create the environment in Postman. So Postman can have environments locally, and I've already created one here that we can see. When you create the client in Foxy, you're going to get the client ID, the secret, and the refresh token. We're just going to go ahead and put these in Postman. And these will be changed later. This gets into a very important thing. And Postman has a blog post right here, securely using API keys in Postman. You would never, ever want to share your keys on a screencast like this. As soon as the screencast is over, I'm going to delete the client, and it's for a test story anyway. But never put your keys in a GitHub repo. Never share them, not even with colleagues. They can make their own clients. They can make their own credentials. But Postman has these now. And the first step that you would do if you were working with an API yourself would be using those to authenticate to the API. Now, that would generally take, you'd have to go through the docs, you'd need to figure things out. But in this case, with this collection that we've imported, we've already got this refresh access token in here. And we can see exactly what's going on. So we can see it's a post. We're going to do a post to this URL. We have some headers here. And the two that we care about are the Foxy API version and the authorization. And this is basic auth is a variable. So we can see here that we also in Postman allows us to run some pre-request and post-request JavaScript. So we are setting that basic auth with the client ID and the client secret. Now you would need to do all of this on your own if you were doing an API integration, or rather you'd use one of our libraries. But if you were just poking around, this would be a big pain in the rear. And then in the body of our post, we have the grant type and the refresh token. And the refresh token, again, Postman has this as an environment variable. So we'll go ahead, hit send, and we can see pretty printed with syntax highlighting the response. There we get the access token, and we get what we need. And now if we go to our environment variables, we see now basic auth and access token are set in our environment variables. Our next step, and this is all documented in our documentation, our walkthrough with Postman, so you don't have to take notes or anything, is a get to API home. So if we just get to the home of the API, we'll see our headers now. We have our authorization, and these are headers that we're setting in the request, the GET request, and it's using the environment variable. And then after we do the request, it's running some JavaScript and setting more environment variables. So we'll just hit Command Enter, and now we can see this response. Now here's where we start to get into some of the hypermedia with our API. So we use the HAL format. It's just a particular, very sort of plain JSON format for hypermedia. And the responses include a links node. That includes things that you can do from here. So we can see the self link, that's where we are, property helpers, and there's explanation about what each of these things do. Our documentation goes into much more detail. We're going to go ahead and run this request now, do another get. We can see from that last one, we added the store URI to our environment variables. And now here we're going to do a get to the store URI, which we got from before. And it's just another get. We have the headers that we want, and we're setting more environment variables. This is all done for you though, so you generally aren't going to need to bother with any of this stuff. And this is our store. So the self is, this is our store URI, that's our store ID. And we can see the attributes, we can see the versions, users that are connected to the store, customers, carts, transactions, subscriptions, everything that can be done on this resource, and all of the child resources, everything that belongs to the store, everything that connects to the store is there in the links. So even the link to pay for the store. And then obviously here, the actual attributes of the store itself. So the store name, the emails, everything like that. So before I continue, do we have any questions? I'm going to switch back to that window. It will be recorded. Oh, that was answered. Okay, cool. Any questions, feel free to ask as we go. So I mentioned in the setup, there's something that's going to be very helpful, and that is in Postman. There's this setting, retain headers when clicking on links. This by default is off. In our walkthrough, we tell you to turn it on, and I'll show you why here. So Postman, as we can see, helps us to make requests. Now, if we wanted to do all of this in without Postman, let's say in the terminal using curl, because sometimes that's just the quickest, this is what that first refresh access token would look like. So this is also really cool with Postman as well. It can export code. So you can mock something up and then say, oh, you know what, I'm using PHP. And here's the code that it generates for you. I'm using Node with request or the native. And it will generate the code for you. This is sometimes helpful if you want to make sure that Postman is not doing any magic for you, because sometimes actually Postman does things with cookies that sometimes can catch you off guard, or at least catches me off guard. So, you know, if you wanted to not use Postman, this is what you'd be dealing with, and then you'd say, okay, now you'd do that, and now you got to get that access token. Now you come over here, and you make another one, and you got to pass that around. So it's, as we can see, Postman is doing a lot for us, but it's all very visible. So now that we are in, we've handled the authentication, we can see the hypermedia in Foxy. So this is if we just get the store URL. This would be, depending on what you're after, it's certainly Postman, this is a good starting place. And we can see all of our links. So let's say, oh, you know what? I want to look into coupons. So we can come in here, search coupon. Okay, let's see all the coupons for the store. So we'll click that. It'll open in a new tab. And because we changed that setting earlier, it retains the headers. So all the authorization headers, all the authentication is already handled. It didn't make the request for us, but let's just do a get. And now we see this is a coupon for the store. And, oh, actually, I created a coupon, but must have done it on the wrong store. This would show you coupons if there were any, which there should have been, but there aren't. And you can also save any of your requests to your collection. So let's go ahead and do transactions. This is a bookmarked effectively request. And we got this URL from the store request. So we'll do a get. And now we'll see here are a ton of transactions. And these have all been anonymized and redacted and such. So if you were building something with the API, you could figure out all of the requests that you wanted to do ahead of time and then think, okay, well, what am I going to get back when I make this request? Oh, that's not quite what I need. All right, well, let's go ahead and do this isn't necessarily Postman specific, but this is the Foxy API. So we'll zoom on the items. So right now, each individual transaction has products, but the products aren't included in this response. This is just including the transactions. But we can see this particular transaction. Let's go ahead and open that one. So we can just click around in Postman and explore the Foxy API using the GUI very quickly and easily and figure out, okay, in my app, in my PHP or Node or Python app or what have you, I want to get the transaction. And what's that going to look like? It's going to look like this. Okay, but I want the items. So we'll go ahead and do zoom items. And now we can see exactly what we should get with the API, and then you can program around that. Now you can see we include the items, and the items have their own hypermedia. So the items might have item options. I don't think this one does, but there we have it. So we're right up on 20 minutes. There's certainly a lot more to discuss, but please go ahead and ask questions. Let's see, use cases. There's a question about use cases. Can you clarify that question a little bit? Use cases with the API or Hypermedia or Postman in particular? I guess I'll answer all of that. So use cases with Hypermedia is an interesting one. Hypermedia, we feel internally, tends to be communicated in a very strange way. A lot of the discussion about Hypermedia is much more technical and not really focused on the tangible benefits. And not to say that there aren't, that we've looked at all the communication about Hypermedia, but it's a weird topic. Hypermedia can be amazing. Where we've found Hypermedia to be particularly useful is in our customer portal, our new customer portal functionality. And we're rebuilding our admin using this Hypermedia API. And where that can be really slick is, let's say on a transaction, there might be optional Hypermedia. There might be Hypermedia for, let's say, a transaction. If the transaction is verified initially, there might be Hypermedia to say, here's something you can do on this transaction that like refund or edit the transaction or capture the transaction. So it's very interesting in that perspective. It's also very natural in certain things for transactions. Let's say, again, a receipt. Well, the receipt, here's the receipt URL, and this is Hypermedia. So it makes a lot of sense to say, here's the URL, which is really the thing that you want. Where it's also interesting is just in how things are linked, where you don't need to know the exact path. Where it gets confusing is in caching and such. And that's where our new NPM package, our Node SDK, handles that automatically for you. But that Hypermedia can get tricky. A use case for Postman is this use case that we're covering is exploring APIs. Now, like I mentioned, Postman can be used for a lot more. You can build APIs. You can do a whole bunch of stuff with Postman. Ken, if you want to if you want to jump in and sell Postman, just let us know. But Postman can do a lot. We're really just focusing on using it to explore an API. Use case for our API is a huge number of things. We can talk to you about that if you'd like separately. Another question. The Zoom is not really related to Hypermedia, not strictly. It is a convention with Hypermedia APIs, so you can keep the payload small, which is I realize sort of funny in that there's a giant links node. We're exploring possibilities to allow the links node to be optional if you don't want to use the Hypermedia. But yeah, the zoom is documented in our API. Zooming, filtering, certain things like that are more specific to our API and not Postman or anything like that. Hypermedia versus GraphQL. Well, I think GraphQL doesn't have that horrible Helios acronym to deal with. We don't have as much experience with GraphQL internally. There are pros and cons. Our API admittedly is much more CRUD, create, read, update, delete type stuff. GraphQL certainly can be really cool in certain use cases, and might we do a GraphQL API down the road? Possibly, but because on the technical side, there are some challenges, especially with how our data is structured and such. So unfortunately, can't really chime in too much about GraphQL there, or GraphQL as it relates to Postman. I don't have any experience with that. Let's see. I'm going to. We're over our 20 minutes, so if anybody wants to drop off, our feelings won't be hurt. I'm going to show a quick demo of more than just a get in Postman. So I'll show creating a cart, which might be interesting, and seeing errors and such in Postman. So here we have another collection here. So we have coupons. We could do coupons. Number of examples. Could create customers. We don't have a bookmark there, but something that comes up that's a bit more advanced, but is sort of interesting, is creating a cart in the API, in the Foxy API. So on your back end, you can create a cart exactly how you want, create or sync a customer, connect the two, get the single sign-on URL, and pass the customer directly to the checkout. So you can use Foxy without the cart. You can use Foxy more just as the checkout page. So here we can see in Postman, it's a post, it's to the carts URL. So in Foxy, you create new things by posting to the collections URL. So we're not posting to a specific cart as well, URL, as we'll see, we're posting to the carts plural URL. And we'll create that, and we'll see it succeeded. Oh, also I didn't show this, but you can show the headers in the response and such, everything that you'd want to see. And here we created a cart. So we can go to that cart, do a get on it. We can see it's empty. There's no customer info, no items if we click through, no items on the cart. And we can also see after we created the cart, we went ahead and set a session variable just to make things easier. Now, using that specific session variable, we can go ahead and do a put to create this cart. And I just showed you here, you can do a number of different formats. You can You can do syntax highlighting. You can do all sorts of things. So we'll go ahead and create this cart, do a put, and it will actually error. Oh, it didn't error. Oh, okay, I thought it was going to error because of category 0. But now we have a cart. And this is where Hypermedia gets sort of interesting. So from this cart now, we can create a session because the cart just exists as a cart. There is no session connected to it. So if we actually wanted to use this cart in the browser, we'd have to do a post here on this session, and then we'd get back the cart link. And if we pull that up in a browser, it would load that cart. So there we can see Postman doing more like that. And as we went over before, you can export this code. You can see exactly what it's doing and actually get it working before then you go back to your editor and try to get it working in the code. So there's our intro to Postman and the Foxy Hypermedia API. We are happy to chat more to answer any questions. And thank you so much for joining us. I hope we've kept this, hope we've answered your questions. Front-end experience. Can you clarify, we didn't do our polls. We'll go ahead and start our polls. Oh, this is a new system for us. Can we do multiple polls at once? We'll try it. Not sure if this is working. Front-end experience. Go ahead and share back an Edge. Here's the cart that we created with the session ID. So this shows you can use the backend API to do things that then modify the front end. You could create customers, modify customers, create carts, modify transactions. You can create a cart, attach a customer, use the API to charge that customer's saved payment method for the cart. So you can even do entire programmatic billing and transactions that way. Okay, how does this make your life easier in layman's terms? So if you are, there are two ways. One is if you want to poke around or if you want to change something in Foxy, sometimes it's easier to do it this way versus the admin. So for instance, if you were doing modifications to coupons, or the current admin doesn't allow you to modify customers. So that's a biggie. Our new admin will. It's possible to modify a customer using the API. Our old admin doesn't expose that. So if a customer says, "Oh, you know what, my email or my address is wrong or needs to be updated," you can do that in some other ways, but sometimes it's just easier to use Postman, pull up the customer, and modify it that way. And in terms of really the biggest benefit is if you are building something with the Foxy API, this can be a lot easier for figuring out your proof of concept. So instead of just banging away in your editor and saving your files and running locally and seeing what the output is and seeing you have an error and you're not getting what you expect and putting a bunch of just console log or echoes in your code to figure out what the response is, and then maybe you're not getting a response and then figure out what the status code is. You just do it all in Postman, mock it up, and then know exactly what you're going to get. If you're not doing API development, then this is not going to be as useful, except for if you need to do something in Foxy and and doing it via the API might be faster than the admin. Can you make a customer terminal where they can see purchasing history and update their own information? Yes, you definitely can. However, you don't need to, because we have a customer portal in, that's the wrong, let me find the URL, in beta. And cool thing about that actually is you can use Postman on that as well. But the responses that the customer portal responds back with are, this is part of a bunch of new functionality that we're working on, where our front end API, the JavaScript client side API, mirrors the backend API. So in our front end API, in this customer portal, the responses for transactions, for the customer details, for the subscriptions, basically for everything here, mirrors the backend API, including Hypermedia. So it's not all the Hypermedia, and there are some things that don't make sense in a front-end context, so they're stripped. But for instance, in the front end and our transactions, we have the receipt. That comes back in the response as Hypermedia, updates and such, the same thing. So this is our customer portal, and this is another, on a practical purpose right now, our old admin does not have the UI to configure these settings. So in order to set up the customer portal, you actually need to use Postman, is the easiest way to do it, to create the settings for the customer portal. And those we do have, that's coming, but you can do it right now with Postman. And there are a number of settings actually here in our documentation. We can show you. Actually, showing the documentation is going to be good too. Customer portal settings. So every resource that you saw in Postman is documented. You can see what's required. You can see all these things, example payloads and such. So our customer portal, though, some of the settings that you can allow, especially cool for recurring billing or for auto ship merchants, is you can allow users to configurably change their next subscription date. You can do things like set specific days of the month, specific days of the week, specific date ranges. So there's a lot of flexibility there. You can also optionally allow for changing the frequency, and you can configure it to disallow changing. So if you're doing a SaaS, for instance, like us, we don't want people to change their frequency. But if you're doing vitamins or pet food or anything like that, then someone's going out of town or they have too much of your product, they might say, you know what, I'll push off the next date by a week or two, I'll change the frequency, etc. Josh posted a beta access signup. So if you are interested in the customer portal, let us know. We can help you get that going. And yeah. Any other questions? Thank you again for joining us. And if you have anything else you'd like to see us cover, please let us know. If you have any questions about our API, how to use it, really just feel free to reach out. We're a friendly bunch, and we are happy we're happy to answer your questions, and we're happy that you joined us. Thank you so much.